At Uppercross, people made Anne feel welcome, helpful, and respected. Now she's in Bath, the place she never wanted to be. She's expecting life to be more like it was at Kellynch Hall. She sees being at Camden Hall as a prison sentence. She's just entering the house and is already thinking about when she can leave. We can see a transformation in Anne immediately. Luckily for Anne, though, Austen has plans for her in these few chapters. She's going to meet 2 new people and be reunited with 2 people from her past. These people will help make her life more tolerable in Bath and are pivotal to the ending of the story. Her first night in Bath was so important that Austen gave an entire chapter to it. When she entered Camden Place, she felt like she was going into a prison, but by the end of the night, she was surprised about how well things went. So what could have made it better? Well, to her surprise, her family was happy to see her. Now, this might be the idea that absence makes the heart grow fonder, or they were really anxious to tell her how great it is to live in Bath and how popular they are and how people are constantly leaving their calling cards in the hopes of having dinner or meeting Sir Walter. Anne also finds out that Mr. Elliot has been there and that Sir Walter has forgiven him. Yes, you heard that. He's forgiven him. What could he have told Sir Walter to make him forgive Mr. Elliot? Well, first, he didn't ghost them. They ghosted him, and he was just too polite to ask why. Second, he never said anything badly about them, and he is willing to confront anyone who says otherwise. And third, his marriage wasn't his fault. You see, Colonel Wallace has been a friend of his for a long time, and the colonel knew of a woman who was rich and had no family, and most importantly, was super in love with Mr. Elliot. So Colonel Wallace set them up. Being so rich and so in love with him, he had no choice but to marry her. Luckily for Mr. Elliot, he was able to convince Sir Walter that she was rich and pretty, 2 things that matter so much to Sir Walter. From Sir Walter's perspective, how could Mr. Elliot have done anything but marry her? So he forgave Mr. Elliot. Elizabeth didn't see things quite the same way, but she forgave him nonetheless. Anne wonders why Mr. Elliot is so set on reuniting with Sir Walter. Mr. Elliot is probably richer than Sir Walter, and he is sure to inherit Kellynch Hall without reuniting, so why the desire to reunite? Anne could only conclude that Mr. Elliot must have actually had an interest in Elizabeth before he got married, and now that he's widowed, he's come to Bath to court Elizabeth. Oh, there's a knock at the door. I wonder who that could be. Yep, Mr. Elliot, the man himself. Sir Walter introduces Anne to him as his youngest daughter. So much for Mary. Hey, maybe that's the kind of behavior that's made Mary so self-conscious. Mr. Elliot recognizes Anne, and she likes that. They talk about Lyme and Louise's accident. Anne was happy with her first night in Bath. The next day, Anne wanted to know 2 things. If Mr. Elliot is there to marry Elizabeth, and if Sir Walter meant to marry Mrs. Clay. Now, I don't think I've talked about Mrs. Clay much. She's Mr. Shepherd's daughter and a widow. If you recall, Mr. Shepherd was from the first video in this series, and he's the one who came up with the idea of Sir Walter moving to Bath and leasing Kellynch Hall. Mrs. Clay became friends with Elizabeth and is in Bath as Elizabeth's confidant and assistant. Anne and Lady Russell are concerned that Mrs. Clay is staying close to Sir Walter in the hopes of convincing him to marry her. While Anne interacts with the family, she's looking for indications that Sir Walter hasn't fallen in love with Mrs. Clay. One of the interactions comes when Anne is alone with Sir Walter and they're talking, and he's complimenting her on how good she looks. He suggests that if she weren't looking so good, he would have offered her a beauty product called Gowland to use to make herself look good, because he suggested that to Mrs. Clay last spring, and a lot of her freckles are now gone. Now, Anne disagrees with that view, but this compliment didn't help Anne's concerns about Mrs. Clay and her father. All right, so getting back to Mr. Elliot, Lady Russell is impressed with him when she meets him and thought he was a good man who wasn't selfish. Really? Lady Russell figured Mr. Elliot wants to make up with the family because he's older and it's natural at his age. Anne thought it was for Elizabeth now that he's free. Mr. Elliot's wife passed away about 7 months previously, and Anne wonders if it's appropriate for her to think of him courting Elizabeth so soon after the death. Now, I don't know how long Mr. Elliot has to pretend to be in mourning. I know from the Victorian era, it's more like a year that a man has to be in mourning for the loss of his wife. But I'm not so sure about the Regency era. I do know that the Regency era is less strict about things like that than the Victorian era. Mr. Elliot's been in mourning for about 7 months, and we know later Lady Russell tells us that he's only a few weeks from the ending of his mourning period, which would make it about 8 months. So if anybody knows more about the mourning period rules for the Regency era, you can let us know in the comments. So Mr. Elliot is one of the people that Anne will meet in Bath. The Dowager Viscountess Dalrymple and her daughter Miss Carteret were the others. The Dowager and her daughter are cousins of the Elliots and are coming to stay in Bath. In a world where appearances matter more than anything else, Sir Walter appeared not to care about the Viscount when he didn't go to the Viscount's funeral or send his condolences. In Sir Walter's defense, he was sick at the time of the funeral and he couldn't go. Why he didn't send a letter of condolence, I don't know. Austen doesn't tell us. The Dowager was so offended by his failure, and she wrote him off and the Elliots off as connections. Does this sound familiar? Can we compare how Sir Walter was treated by the Dowager to how Sir Walter treated Mr. Elliot when he thought that Mr. Elliot had slighted him? To be seen in Bath with their cousins, Sir Walter had to write a letter of apology to the Dowager. The letter wasn't great, but it did the job. When they met the Dowager and her daughter, everyone was less than impressed with the ladies. Anne and Mr. Elliot, while discussing the Dalrymples, had a conversation about the idea of good company. Anne doesn't want acquaintances with the Dowager or anybody else if it's only for a place in society. Mr. Elliot reminded her it was important for Sir Walter to establish all the dignity and credit deserved to him for his position. Then he pointed out that any acquaintance of Sir Walter's is a diversion from a possible attachment to Mrs. Clay. Anne is happily surprised to find that Mr. Elliot sees what she sees. All right, so now Anne has met the two connections in Bath. Now Anne is about to reunite with a childhood friend. She heard that her friend, Miss Hamilton, who is now Mrs. Smith, was in Bath. Anne and Mrs. Smith met when she was 14 and Mrs. Smith was 17. This was right after Anne's mother had passed away, and she was sent back to school, still grieving for her mother's death, and very homesick and miserable. Mrs. Smith befriended her and helped her through this very rough time at school. All she knew of her friend was shortly after graduation, she married a wealthy man. It seems that her husband died about 2 years before the two reunited, and his finances were a mess, and now she's broke. Sometime after her husband died, she contracted rheumatic fever, and it settled in her legs, so she came to Bath to help in her recovery. The ladies easily rekindled their friendship. Lady Russell would convey her to her friends whenever Anne wanted to go, but Anne didn't tell her family about Mrs. Smith yet. Austen described Mrs. Smith as changing from a pretty, healthy, and confident girl to a poor, infirm, helpless woman. Anne was really surprised that her friend was in good spirits in spite of her situation. Mrs. Smith did admit that when she came to Bath, she almost fell into a depression because she got sick on the way there and was stuck in Bath with no friends, no family, and no money for a nurse. She didn't expect anyone to help her the way she needed and the way a family or friend would. But to her surprise, her landlady and her landlady's sister helped her, and now she feels like she's in good hands. After she recovered from her illness and regained the use of her hands, her nurse, the landlady's sister, taught her to knit, and her nurse now sells her knittings for her. One day, Lady Dalrymple invited the family to a party, and Anne was forced to tell her family about Mrs. Smith because she was already set to visit Mrs. Smith that night. Sir Walter, of course, didn't approve of this friend. After all, she had no rank, no money, and she was probably unattractive. Anne visited with her friend anyway, and Sir Walter and Elizabeth went to Lady Dalrymple's. After the party, Lady Russell was convinced that Mr. Elliot wanted Anne, not Elizabeth. She speculates that Mr. Elliot plans to court Anne once his widowhood requirement is over in a few weeks. Lady Russell thinks he might be able to make Anne happy, and she would love to see Anne as the mistress of Kellynch Hall. Though Anne likes the idea of being like her mother, she doesn't fully trust Mr. Elliot. He's not as open as she would like, and she doesn't really know his character. She likes him, But she can't forget his past, and she thinks he has a really bad habit of doing things like traveling on Sundays. For Anne, though, his biggest transgression is that he's never moved by either good or evil behavior of others. It's now February, and Anne's been in Bath for about a month. Her last letter from Mary was 3 weeks ago, and she is really eager to know what's going on at Uppercross. The letter contains a lot of complaints by Mary about not having many visitors, the Musgroves, Charles Hayter, and the Harvilles. She thinks the Harvilles left their kids at the Musgroves for far too long and doesn't understand how they could do that. But later in the letter, she wishes she could come to Bath. She says the visit might take them from home for as much as 6 weeks, and they, of course, wouldn't bring the kids with them. Then the letter ended with nothing about Louisa. Anne must have been so disappointed. Oh, but wait, there's a second letter. Mary wrote that she held the original letter just in case there was news from Lyme. And boy, is there. First, she has to complain more, but then she gets to the point. Louisa and Captain Benwick are engaged. Anne must be quite surprised, as you can imagine. Elizabeth asked about Mary, but she really didn't care about the answer. After reading the letter, Anne starts to worry about Captain Wentworth and whether he's angry at his friend Captain Benwick. We all know she knows very well how unforgiving Captain Wentworth can be. She wanted to talk to the Crofts, who are in town, to make sure Captain Wentworth is okay with Captain Benwick, but every time she saw the Crofts, she was busy, usually with Lady Russell. One day, Anne was walking home alone when she ran into Admiral Croft. He told her about Louisa and Captain Benwick. You can imagine Anne's thinking, yeah, I know this. What about Frederick? Is he angry? And does he feel betrayed by Captain Benwick? The Admiral said he didn't believe Captain Wentworth was upset at all by what happened. But for some reason, this wasn't good enough for Anne, but she did let it go. Anne had lots of feelings right now. Happiness for Louisa and Captain Benwick, a little sadness for Captain Wentworth, but there was this little tinge of happiness that Frederick was not engaged. Admiral Croft noted that there were a lot of nice-looking women in Bath and asked Anne if they should invite Captain Wentworth to Bath. Gee, I wonder how Anne would answer this question. Now is the time for the last important person Austen wants Anne to meet, someone from her past. The next time Anne is out, she's with Elizabeth, Mrs. Clay, and Mr. Elliot. They're walking, and it starts to rain. The rain is light, but still enough to where the group doesn't really want to continue their walk. They happen to see that Lady Dalrymple's carriage was nearby. The ladies ducked into a shop while Mr. Elliot went to ask if the carriage could be used to take them home. Lady Dalrymple's carriage could only hold 2 additional people, so there was a discussion about who should take the carriage. Elizabeth, of course, but who would go with her? Both Anne and Mrs. Clay offered to walk with Mr. Elliot, but ultimately Mrs. Clay was chosen to go with Elizabeth. What a surprise there. While waiting for the carriage, Anne looks out the window and sees Captain Wentworth. Turns out Mrs. Croft didn't need to invite her brother because as Anne was walking and talking with Admiral Croft, Captain Wentworth was already on his way to Bath. He came into the same shop, and they were both startled with each other, though Anne handled it much better than Frederick. Austen tells us Anne felt agitation, pain, pleasure, and something between delight and misery. Okay, so Anne is never going to get over Captain Wentworth, but it looks like, based on his reaction, maybe he's a little less angry with her. There's a little small talk with Wentworth and Anne's party, no mention of Louisa. She can see how uncomfortable he is, and she sees that something has changed in the way they interact with each other. He assumes she's getting on the carriage and going home with her sister, and is surprised to find that she's going to finish her walk with Mr. Elliot. You know, because of the rain and stuff. Wentworth remembers Mr. Elliot and how he looked at Anne. Anne walks off with Mr. Elliot, her arm under his, and she casually looks at Captain Wentworth and says, "Good morning to you." Do you think Anne is playing up this so that the impression it gives Mr. Wentworth to kind of make him a little jealous? On the walk, Anne really didn't want to talk because all she could think about was Captain Wentworth. Since Lady Russell is such a big part of Anne's life, She soon realized that Lady Russell is going to find out that Captain Wentworth is in town, and she's worried about how Lady Russell is going to react. Well, she doesn't have to wait very long, because the next morning, Anne and Lady Russell are walking and Anne saw Captain Wentworth. She wonders if Lady Russell saw him too. And yep, she spotted him. But she pretends that she didn't. Phew. Oh, but darn, in all her worry about Lady Russell, she missed to see whether or not he saw them. It's been a whole 2 days since she last saw Captain Wentworth, because her family keeps going to these private parties and not really interacting with a lot of people. So Anne is really happy when she finds out that they're going to go to the theater for an evening of music, and Captain Wentworth is probably going to be there. She really wants to see Captain Wentworth, because she feels obliged to talk to him. She felt this obligation so much that she canceled a visit that she was supposed to have with Mrs. Smith the night of the theater. When changing her plans with Mrs. Smith, Smith indicated that their friendship might be coming to an end soon. Anne is confused by this, but for some reason chooses not to ask what that means.